1,000 people marched on Parliament. Their message, legalise marijuana.
Join in the fight to legalise cannabis so we can destroy the web of these tarantulas.
This man chose poetry to get his message across. At Speaker's Corner in King George Square, there were many more, from doctors to lawyers, speaking in one voice.
That the current policy and legislation, both in Queensland and throughout Australia and the Western world, in relation to cannabis, is wrong in principle and has failed miserably in practice.
The police are so involved in chasing people with tiny quantities of marijuana that they haven't got any time to do anything about robbery and violence.
Organised by Hemp, or Help End Marijuana Prohibition, the rally called for marijuana to be legalised. Speakers claiming Australia has 2 million regular users of cannabis, with relaxed laws in South Australia and Canberra. If nothing else, Hemp says today's rally should serve as a reminder that marijuana use is part of our society. It's more widespread than most care to admit, and that continuing to keep it illegal is not going to make it go away. To drive that message home, they marched. Almost 1,000 people crowded outside the gates of Parliament House, determined that this protest wasn't over yet. They didn't get him. Instead, Peter Beattie accepted the stack of petitions and made it inside before things got nasty. Eventually the crowd dispersed, some claiming they were going home for a smoke. Ernestine Laval, 10 News.
About 200 people marched through the city before staging a rally outside Parliament House. Locked gates stopped the group from delivering a weighty petition calling for drug law reform.
You didn't happen to count how many signatures you've got on there?
There were more than 20,000, and Labor backbencher Peter Beattie promised to take them to his parliamentary colleagues tomorrow.
Immediate decriminalisation of cannabis. They also called for its legalisation in the longer term. Protesters say the tougher the laws, the higher the cost of drugs, which only encourages underworld activity and corruption. They say decriminalisation would save taxpayers almost $2 million a year and would free up police personnel for what they call real crime. Protesters marched on Parliament House with a petition containing more than 20,000...
To Beattie, a giant replica joint tossed over the fence was quickly removed by police.
There was certainly a lot of huffing, and by the time the march reached Parliament, there was much puffing. The smell of marijuana wafted over George Street as dozens lit up in an act of defiance and provocation. For a while, police turned a blind eye, but it was only a matter of time before the first arrest. All up, there were 7.
The law is at fault.
To the sheer frustration of the dope smokers, there were no more.
I want to be arrested. I'm smoking a joint in front of them. They must arrest me.
Hampered by a lack of resources, the police refused to be pushed into mass arrests.
We will end up with 200 or 300 of them arrested, and we just cannot process that many as it stands, not with the resources we've got here at the moment.
It's a fight Hemp is unlikely to win. Given the Premier's stance and opposition policies, it seems the protesters' dream itself will go up in smoke. Lane Kelcart, National 9 News.
The protesters' plan was to have as many people arrested as possible. They say to show up the deficiencies in the law.
Carry on without me. I've just been unavoidably detained.
Only 7 arrests were made, much to the distress of some of the protesters.
Arrest me. I demand to be arrested.
The rally dispersed once a Hemp submission was presented and it became clear officers would be making no more arrests. Gillian Whiting, 7 Nightly News. Protesters arrested for smoking marijuana in front of Parliament House in October appeared in court. Alison Rose reports his defence didn't convince the court. He was found guilty just minutes ago.
Tony Knipe is not frightened to admit he smokes dope. The head of the pro-cannabis lobby group Hemp is fighting to have the drug legalised. In October, he led thousands marching on Parliament House. Dozens openly smoked marijuana joints. Tony Knipe was the first of 7 to be arrested.
Carry on without me. I've just been unavoidably detained.
Today he appeared in the magistrate's court to face 1 count of possession.
I mean, I was arrested with some reluctance. Of course, that was a political point, and we are continuing to plead in that light.
Outside the court, Mr Knipe claimed that a majority of Australians aged between 18 and 35 have admitted using dope at least once. He now wants the drug legalised using the so-called Dutch model,
where you can actually go to certain coffee shops and legitimately purchase small amounts of marijuana and consume it legally on the premises.
In court today, Mr Knipe argued that under common law he should not be prosecuted. The reason, he says, is that everybody should be treated equally and not everybody who was allegedly smoking marijuana on the day was arrested. Alison Rose, 10 News.
1. He appealed his drug conviction, claiming cannabis is not a dangerous drug. But Peter Kelly reports his fight was short-lived. The court took just 10 minutes to dismiss that appeal.
Late last year, the group called Help End Marijuana Prohibition staged a noisy and smoky protest outside Parliament House.
We don't have the resources to process all these people.
But the police did process Roger Brand. The 38-year-old public servant was arrested, convicted and fined $300. Today, Brand took his case to the Court of Appeal, arguing without the aid of a lawyer that cannabis is not a dangerous drug and therefore not illegal. The hearing lasted just 10 minutes. The appeal thrown out on the basis that cannabis is specified as a dangerous drug under the Drugs Misuse Act. Your real complaint is that you disagree with the law, Mr Justice Fitzgerald said. And Chief Justice McCrossan, you do know and accept that we're obliged to apply the law as it is. Outside the court, Mr Brand said he was neither surprised nor particularly disappointed by the decision.
But certainly it's cost me nothing, and I've not laid down and just accepted the law, which myself and 75% of Australians believe is wrong. Gone up to the Supreme Court and told them how I feel.
The court hasn't seen the last of the marijuana protesters. Another of those arrested outside Parliament House, Tony Knipe, will have a similar appeal heard in the coming weeks. Peter Kelly, 10 News.
A Brisbane public servant's bid to overturn a fine for possessing marijuana. Roger Brand argued it was his common law right to smoke the drug because he claims it's not dangerous.
38-year-old public servant Roger Brand arrived at the Criminal Court of Appeal with high expectations.
The Supreme Courts of a number of European countries have decriminalised marijuana.
Other self-confessed marijuana smokers offered moral support.
It's not dangerous because no one has ever died of an overdose of marijuana.
Mr Brand was arrested after a marijuana rally in Brisbane last year and was later fined $300 by a magistrate. He hoped the appeals court would overturn what he calls an archaic and unpopular ruling.
After only 10 minutes, the 3-member panel firmly stubbed out the appeal, telling Mr Brand it was obliged to apply the law as it stands.
Despite the rejection, the unsuccessful appellant remains philosophical.
Certainly it's cost me nothing, and I've not laid down and just accepted the law, which myself and 75% of Australians believe is wrong.
It's now possible the matter will be taken to the High Court. Neil Dawley, 7 Nightly News.
His conviction. The man appealed a magistrate's decision in the Supreme Court saying marijuana is not a dangerous drug.
Roger Brand arrived at court hoping to convince 3 of Queensland's most senior judges that marijuana isn't a dangerous drug. A magistrate convicted Mr Brand of possessing the drug during a pro-marijuana rally last year. Organisers wanted arrests in order to test the state's drug laws, but within minutes of stating his case today, Mr Brand's appeal was dismissed. The judges ruled that it was not up to them to define what is dangerous, but to merely interpret the law as passed by Parliament.
But certainly it's cost me nothing, and I've not laid down and just accepted the law, which myself and 75% of Australians believe is wrong. Despite losing today's appeal, hemp organisers say they'll continue to use the Supreme Court to challenge marijuana laws.
They say future appeals will argue that police at last year's rally should have arrested all the lawbreakers, not just a handful. The Help End Marijuana Prohibition group will also continue its campaign for law reform by fielding candidates at this year's state election.
Paul Clarick has more.
Last year, the Criminal Justice Commission handed down a series of recommendations concerning the use of cannabis. Today, the public got the chance to have its say on the report to the All-Party Parliamentary Committee, which oversees the CJC. Among the submissions, one from the Help End Marijuana Prohibition group. Hemp says the CJC hasn't paid enough attention to the role organised crime plays in cannabis production and distribution.
The amount of money which Queenslanders spend on marijuana each year is $600 million.
Hemp says legalisation would see the government reap a large share of that in taxes, instead of it going to criminals. The police don't agree.
That was a fact, that would be the case, but it's not a fact. I don't believe that it would put a dent on organised crime.
And while Hemp says the CJC recommendations don't go far enough, the police believe they go too far.
We consider we've got our hands tied behind our back. At the present time we don't have telephone intercept powers, and we still believe we should have the power to enter premises without warrant.
Hemp believes public support for their cause is growing and that politicians will one day see the light.
Any major party which chooses to pick up the legalisation ball and run with it will do well electorally.
The Parliamentary Committee will make its own set of recommendations, but the committee doesn't know when that's likely to be.
Pro-marijuana demonstrators lit up on the steps of police headquarters. While police outside chose to ignore them, detectives inside proclaimed Noah a success.
So far, 83% of the calls made this morning was relating to the people that we're looking at, the manufacturers and distributors of dangerous drugs.
The Civil Liberties Council says the phone-in is a futile and expensive waste of time.
Almost 100 members of the Help and Marijuana Prohibition Group picketed Queensland's police headquarters today. But at midday, they became targets of an egg-throwing anti-drug campaigner. Police arrested the man and he was later charged with disorderly conduct.
Keep dope illegal. It's unhealthy, it's bad for you, it's a corruption.
Hemp is calling for the abolition of Operation Noah, the annual police campaign where people can ring in to anonymously dob in a drug dealer. Hemp says marijuana smokers and dealers shouldn't be subject to the same laws as other drug users.
It's very easy to point out that marijuana is extremely harmless. No one has ever died of a marijuana overdose, ever.
About half a dozen people openly flaunted drug laws by smoking pot at today's rally. None of today's marijuana smokers were arrested. Police say this year's Operation Noah is targeting suppliers rather than small-scale users. While the protest continued outside, almost 200 police officers were busy fielding hundreds of calls from informers.
And questioned, but none were charged. An analysis of the suspected drug confirming it was a mixture of parsley, mulberry leaves and grass cuttings. Ernestine Laval, 10 News.
Students holding a smoke-in at Queensland University today, detaining 4 of them. No charges have been laid. The students were pushing for marijuana to be legal in Queensland.
Student groups had advertised the smoke-in as a chance to openly defy the law by smoking marijuana. Preparations were made, joints rolled ready to be passed around, then police moved in. 4 students were detained for suspected drug use. Organisers say the only substance being smoked was parsley. The material was taken away by police for analysing. Students had achieved their goal, a show of support for legalising cannabis. The group gives many reasons in support of decriminalisation, among them the strain marijuana use places on the justice system.
The laws as they currently stand are quite unenforceable and quite ridiculous to expect the police to be able to enforce.
The state government, supported by the Australian Medical Association, again today rejected calls for the legalisation of marijuana. Rebecca Jensen, National 9 News.
Good evening. More than a dozen people have been arrested during a protest in the centre of Brisbane. The demonstrators were calling for marijuana to be made legal. Police moved when some of the protesters began smoking the drug outside Parliament.
By 1 o'clock, more than 500 pro-marijuana protesters had gathered in King George Square. There they heard speaker after speaker attack the law which makes smoking the drug an offence.
The prohibition doesn't work. There was no drug problem before drug prohibition.
The crowd then marched through the streets escorted by police to Parliament House. Police watched behind locked gates until the inevitable happened.
So here we are outside Parliament House and smoking pot.
Not for long.
Mate, you're detained under the prison of the drug misuse.
The man was led away, followed by a now angry crowd.
The rest of the protesters then effectively laid siege to the building while police reinforcements stood ready.
Police asked the crowd to move on. Instead, the protesters staged a sit-in. It was the signal for more arrests. One demonstrator was shaken after being hit by a car. Others continued to block traffic until the patience of the police was exhausted. The protesters tried to do just that, but the police had other ideas.
You are breaking my arm! You are breaking my arm! My arm!
Some went quietly, but they were in the minority as more arrests were made. After marching to the watch house, the demonstration finally broke up, the protesters claiming they'd made their point. Paul Murphy, National 9 News.
Protesters calling for the legalisation of marijuana clashed with police after a march on Parliament.
We smoke pot and we won't stop!
More than 500 joined the march, clogging city streets and condemning the Goss government. At Parliament House, they were met by a wall of blue, willing to ignore abuse, but not a deliberate flouting of the law.
Is that cannabis? Mate, you're detained under the provisions of the Drug Misuse Act.
Amid pushing, shoving and shouting,
I don't get busted!
Hemp Party state election candidate Tony Knipe was bustled into the protected grounds of Parliament House.
Other pot smokers demanded to be taken away as well, but the police were turning a blind eye.
Things turned ugly after a sit-in developed, blocking one of the entrances to the freeway. The patience of another motorist finally expiring. That incident sparked more heated confrontations with police and more arrests. More than a dozen protesters were arrested. They faced charges ranging from obstruction to assaulting police and possessing drugs. Chris Blackburn, 7 Nightly News.
Streets demanding the legalisation of cannabis use. About a dozen people were arrested as the protest escalated into violence.
Hundreds of protesters who want the personal use of marijuana decriminalised gathered outside Brisbane City Hall, many smoking the drug openly.
Legalise for 95!
Protesters planned a peaceful demonstration marching through city streets.
The only police presence will be when they help us out, slowing the traffic down and letting us go through. The police have been very helpful.
But the mood changed when the group reached Parliament House, with protesters deciding to block traffic. Police tried to persuade the protesters to clear the road, but when the demonstrators stood firm, police moved in. And one motorist decided he'd clear his own path. More arrests followed as protesters moved to Brisbane's Watch House, waiting for other demonstrators arrested earlier. Charges included possession of a dangerous drug, obscene language and obstructing police. Tony Knipe, who's standing in Saturday's election for a pro-decriminalisation group, was released after being charged with possession of a dangerous drug.
I don't know. Was this police getting out of hand, or is this an election stunt re-law and order by Wayne Goss?
Queensland's Health Minister was interrupted during a media conference, refusing to confirm Labor policy on cannabis.
Oh, sure, I don't support the legalisation of marijuana. It's a very simple response.
The protesters say they'll continue their demonstration tomorrow, as those charged today appear before the courts.
ACTU President...
State elections joined the march and called for marijuana to be made legal. Police moved in when some of the group began smoking the drug outside Parliament House. Others staged a sit-down protest, blocking traffic and prompting more arrests from police.